And that other side is seen right here. This is 101 Bernal Drive in South San Jose. You know, it's got a Vietnamese food place. It's got a little strip mall there, everything like that. The reason I'm showing you this one is that this place is where in 1981 it was discovered that the groundwater had been tremendously polluted because of residue seeping into the ground from a Fairchild plant. You know, when Silicon Valley first started, it was trumpeting itself as, oh, no smokestacks, you know, no pollution, no nothing. Well, as we know now, that is not exactly the case. There are a number of toxic Superfund cleanup sites that the earliest Silicon Valley establishments, such as Fairchild, left behind. But technology had another aspect to things as well, because technology, when combined with the political environment and the manufacturing infrastructure that had been developed during World War II, meant that California's prosperity in the post-World War II era really related to military technology, or what became known as the aerospace industry. I showed you this picture a couple of weeks ago. This was kind of the airplane version of the mothball fleet that had been left over after World War II. But the picture symbolizes the way in which California during World War II had become a hub of military manufacturing, you know, for the Pacific theater. By 1948, the Cold War really heats up again. After World War II, there's a couple of years. Churchill gives his Iron Curtain speech in 1946. President Truman gives his Truman Doctrine speech in 1947. In 1948, you have the Berlin blockade. So over a couple of years, the Cold War becomes a fact of life, and the hoped for decrease in military spending that a lot of people were expecting after World War II ramps up again. And in fact, by 1948, as I indicate in this graphic here, 55% of the Pentagon's aircraft contracts were in California. So California during the post-war era becomes a place that from the beginning, a lot of the prosperity is driven by military spending.
Let us be aware.
And what happens is that there's kind of, during the 50s and 60s, there's an increase in military spending. During the 70s, after the conclusion of the Vietnam War, there's a downgrade. But then in the 1980s, things pick up again under the administration of President Reagan.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world. It was C.S. Lewis who, in his unforgettable Screwtape letters, wrote, "The greatest evil is not done now in those sordid dens of crime that Dickens loved to paint. It is not even done in concentration camps and labor camps. In those we see its final result. But it is conceived and ordered, moved, seconded, carried, and minuted in clear, carpeted, warmed, and well-lighted offices by quiet men with white collars and cut fingernails and smooth-shaven cheeks who do not need to raise their voice. Well, because these quiet men do not raise their voices, because they sometimes speak in soothing tones of brotherhood and peace, because like other dictators before them, they're always making their final territorial demand, some would have us accept them at their word and accommodate ourselves to their aggressive impulses. But if history teaches anything, it teaches that simple-minded appeasement or wishful thinking about our adversaries is folly. It means the betrayal of our past, the squandering of our freedom. So I urge you to speak out against those who would place the United States in a position of military and moral inferiority. You know, I've always believed that old Screwtape reserved his best efforts for those of you in the church. So in your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
So under the Reagan administration in the 1980s, there was a dramatic increase in military spending. And you can see that that was actually very popular in the country. And in 1984, with ads like this one, President Reagan was reelected in one of the great landslides of modern presidential elections.
There's a bear in the woods. For some people, the bear is easy to see. Others don't see it at all. Some people say the bear is tame. Others say it's vicious and dangerous. Since no one can really be sure who's right, isn't it smart to be as strong as the bear? If there is a bear.
And in this buildup, in this military buildup, the state that was best prepared to benefit from it was, in fact, California, President Reagan's home state. I've got this there. Let me get this. There we go. In 1965, 500 Californians had been working in what broadly conceived of as the aerospace industry. But this really dramatically increases in 1984 and the 1980s. In the 1 year, 1984, Los Angeles County received $14 billion in defense contracts. That's an amazing amount of money. If I can get this, so I get President Reagan there too, and do this. Well, we'll get him there. You know what he looks like. And another $7 billion was divided among Orange, San Diego, Santa Barbara, and San Bernardino County. So that's $21 billion for Southern California in defense spending in that 1 year of 1984, which was the year of the height of the Reagan military buildup. In 1984, you probably all recognize that, the blue cube. The city of Sunnyvale had a larger defense budget, or had more defense contracts than 29 states in the country. You know, and the blue cube, I'll never forget the first time I saw it off of 101, which is right there. You know, and I'm interested, and you probably all remember too. It was such an incredibly imposing kind of structure. Lockheed and Burbank manufactured during the whole post-war period, but especially in the 80s, planes and submarine-launched missiles. There was a time, I don't know if it's still the case now, but I suspect it probably is, that every missile on every submarine, you know, every nuclear missile that can be launched from a submarine in the American Armed Forces was made by Lockheed. That was a tremendous kind of thing. The B-1 bomber which was a hallmark of that military buildup, was built at the Rockwell plant, or the North American Aviation Plant, which was a division of Rockwell in El Segundo, right outside of L.A. That's not right outside of L.A. right there, but that's where it was built. And of course, the Hughes Aircraft Plant, which is right next to the marina in Los Angeles, was a huge part of the post-war complex. By the 80s, that had been pretty much gone. This big building right here, one of these big buildings, I think it was this one right there. That big building was where the Spruce Goose, that huge plane that Hughes built. That's where that was headquartered. Northrop Grumman, again in LA, was the one that built the stealth bomber. So the prosperity of California during the 1980s was phenomenal. A lot of new people moved out to California to get jobs in these defense industries, and the element of that prosperity was basically military spending.